control of this. Right. So you can see my screen, eh?
Yep.
And I suppose it's the question that George posed the other day about, if we're talking about limits as such, generally we're talking about approaching from above and below, and using that, your finger rule. You know what I mean by that, eh?
Yeah.
On the graphs. Okay, but obviously x tends to infinity. We're really thinking about only approaching from the left, or if x tends to negative infinity, then approaching from the right. But thinking of that, what is that approach? As 1 over x, what does that approach as x gets to closer and closer to infinity?
Is it closer to 0?
Yeah, because what type of graph is y equals 1 over x?
I can't remember the name of it, but
it's hyperbola.
The cross one.
Yeah, it's hyperbola. It's the one on your graph, yeah? Oh, sorry, one on your screen now.
Oh, yeah.
And as you see it, as it gets closer and closer to, as we're at to 70 and it's trying to touch the graph, but if, as soon as we get closer and closer to infinity, it's getting really close and close to 0, but it will never actually touch 0.
Right, yep.
Happy with that statement?
Yes.
So that there, therefore, is 0. All right? So if we think of it as a fraction, does this here or this part here have any real bearing as x gets closer and closer to infinity?
No.
So what we think about is well, what is happening to that over that? What's happening as x gets closer and closer to that one?
Getting closer and closer to 1?
Let's have a look, eh? I'm just trying to, might have to refresh the screen. Reload. Cool. So what was it? Y equals x minus 1
over x plus 2?
X plus 2, x minus 1. What's it getting closer and closer to?
1.
1. And where'd the 1 come from?
Well, x over x is 1.
Yeah. So what you do is if I divide this top line by x and I divide the bottom line by x, does that seem like a really funky thing to do?
No, not really.
I haven't explained this very well, so I'll start again. I'm going to divide the top line by x, and I'm going to divide the bottom line by x. What happens is this turns into two separate fractions where I'm both dividing by x, eh?
Yes.
Yeah. And this part here is 0, isn't it? When x gets closer and closer to infinity?
Yes.
So therefore, and this is 1, and this is 1. That basically leaves me with 1 over 1, which is 1.
So in other words, you can ignore the 1 and the minus 1 and the plus 2.
In other words, yeah, you ignore the lesser values of x because they are going to get closer and closer to 0.
Yeah.
Leo, Dimitri, did that make sense to you guys?
Yep.
Because if I give you this one here now, what is going to affect this parabola and this parabola more? Which is the biggest contribution?
The square.
Yeah, this part here, right? So what we do, and if I'll graph it again, if someone can just read it out to me. X squared minus 5x. No one can read it out to me because it's on a different screen. Plus 3. Plus 3. This should be an x to the power of 2. This is x to the power of 2.
Isn't it 3x to the power of 2?
3x, yep.
4x
Plus 4x minus 1, was it?
Yeah.
That's a real funky looking graph, eh? But what's this value getting closer and closer to?
0.
No?
Or is it? Oh, it's going up.
It's slightly increasing.
Yeah, what's it getting closer and closer to?
Half?
Not a half, but
A
close.
third.
A third. Where'd the third come from?
The x over 3x squared. X squared over 3x squared.
It comes from the coefficients of the biggest impact towards x.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
Leo, Dimitri, did you make sense of that? It's quite a funky way of explaining it, but
Yeah, I got it.
so mathematically what we're doing is we're actually dividing each of these terms by the biggest coefficient of it. No, the biggest exponent of x. Does that make sense what I just said then? Does that even make? We divide each of those terms by the x squared because x squared is the biggest power of x, I suppose. 2 is the biggest power of x.
So then when you're like substituting in the infinity for x, like it shows like for 1 over x squared. So that's just basically 0. That's why the first coefficient matters.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So this part here, that part there, sorry, I'll do a different color. This part here, try and do in a different color. Pencil, work, whatever, I'll just do it in this one. This one here, this gets closer to 0. That gets closer to 0. That one gets closer to 0 because that is in essence just 5 over x, isn't it?
Yeah.
That one there gets closer to 0 because that's 4 over x. X squared over x squared, that's just 1. And the bottom one is 3. And all these other ones are basically tending towards zeros. So that's why it's getting closer and closer to a third.
Yeah. That makes sense. That's a good way of doing it.
It's quite a hard one. I'm happy I had this conversation because it's a really hard one to actually talk through without the feedback from you guys.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the book it just says you should divide by x with like without many explanation of why. It's just like, you should just do it. Yeah,
and I suppose when I was going back, because obviously I learned this a wee while ago, when I was going back before I started teaching it again, I got confused with the stuff as well, and it probably wasn't until we went through this in a couple of lessons that I realised that there was the easiest way of understanding it. And then there's questions like this one here. Do you understand why there's no limit for this one here?
Well, because it's
just tending towards
the
actual
just keep
value
going up.
Isn't it?
It's just going to keep going bigger and bigger and bigger. There's no actual finite number that's getting closer and closer and closer to.
Yeah.
Happy with that, Leo? Happy with that, Dimitri?
Yeah.
Yeah, also see. Let's just shuffle. So you happy with that limit as x tends to infinity?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Makes a lot more sense now.
So if I give you a question like the limit as x tends to infinity of x plus 3 over x squared plus 2x plus 4, what's that going to be?
It's going to end up with x divided by x squared, which is 1 over x.
So 0, isn't it?
That's going to be 0, yeah, because
1 over x it tends to 0, yeah.
Because I don't exactly remember the question, but I think it was that there. Like these parts will tend to 0, that will tend to 0 because that's 1 over the 0.
X.
Because if you do that mathematical simplification stuff, that step that I didn't actually do a lot of, it's going to become 3x over x squared minus 1 over x squared all over x squared over x squared. And that's going to be, that top line then is going to be 0 and the bottom line is going to be 1. So that's why it's going to be equal to 0. Happy with that?
Yeah.
All right, I'll stop that recorder before I start confusing myself even more. But hopefully that was helpful.